Hello, hello, and salutations, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is James Wiley, and I'm an exhibitions assistant here at V&A Dundee. In today's lunchtime talk session, we are joined by Suchitra Choudhury. Suchitra Choudhury, Research Fellow of 2020, supported by the William Lind Foundation at the University of Glasgow, is an independent scholar who specialises in English literature associated with India and the way in which the field negotiates material culture, especially textiles. Suchitra is also a contributing member of the V&A Dundee's Scottish Design Galleries Advisory Group. Museum objects were once everyday items, but it can be hard to imagine their original context when seeing them as carefully conserved and displayed artefacts. Though the objects in question today appear to originate from what was traditionally known as the East, they were all produced by 19th century Scots. So, this lunchtime, join Suchitra Choudhury as she reconsiders and unpicks the histories of three popular objects on display within the Scottish Design Galleries: the Hookah, the Oriental Shawl, and the printed Paisley pattern. Before I invite Suchitra to join us, I will draw your attention to some Zoom functions available to use this afternoon. Today's talk is being BSL interpreted by Max. You can spotlight Max's video by using the three dots on the top right corner of their video box to select Pin Video. If you'd like to use the closed captions, please enable this using the CC button located at the bar at the bottom of the screen. Details on how to use these features have been posted in the chat. Questions are certainly encouraged and welcomed. You can share your questions for our attention throughout Suchitra's presentation using the Q&A button located on the bar at the bottom of your screen. We shall address these at the end of Suchitra's presentation. And finally, if you're going to chat about this event online, which we do encourage, we'd love it if you could tag us at V&A Dundee. Anywho, that's all from me, and now I'll hand over to our guest speaker today, Suchitra Choudhury.
Hi, James. Hi, everyone. Sorry. Yeah. Welcome, everyone, to this lunchtime event, a midday event and a lunchtime event, at least in Britain. So I'm absolutely so happy that you've all been able to make it here. And so I'll just begin my talk by sharing my screen. So here we go. Just a wee while. Yes, there it is, our talk. But before I begin this talk, I'd like to make a dedication to a very dear friend who passed away earlier this year. And Eta Torjonne Pew, this is for you, Pew, Kakuli Bhattacharya. And there we have a picture of her as well. So lovely. So I will begin my talk by recalling a small incident that happened over a year ago. I had visited Dundee and the Scottish Design Gallery at the V&A when I was struck by some objects on display. It included a silver-plated hookah, yes, the hookah of the title, and a shisha, as we call them these days, a paisley pattern on a cotton cloth, and a paisley shawl. So here's the shisha, the famous one, and here's the cotton, here's the paisley pattern printed on cotton, and here's another one. There we go. And this is the paisley shawl. I suspect it's the, the reverse side of the shawl, but maybe not, but maybe that's just me reproducing the picture. So I hope that's okay. Right. Of course, most of us are aware of V&A's absolute love affair with India. Subcontinental objects, no doubt, can offer a unique feast to the eyes anyways. But in recent months and years, we have increasingly come to realize that Britain's imperial experience clearly forms an important rationale and background to these collections. Interestingly, some of these objects on display at Dundee clearly seem to offer much more. How so? But just wait a bit. Just let me go back to my stroll and promenade through the gallery when I stood facing the beautiful hookah. There it is again. I was overjoyed to find this elaborate smoking apparatus in the gallery, even though it just looks like a work of art, but there is a long pipe cleverly hidden at the base. And I thought to myself, what an iconic craftwork from the East. But then I leaned closer and the label said on the lines that, here we go. From 1815, the Edinburgh goldsmith from Hamilton and Company was working in Calcutta. Hamilton's produced silverwares for British and Indian clients, which combine styles and techniques from both cultures. This hookah, a smoking pipe, showcases Indian bidri-ware, a technique of inlaying blackened alloy of zinc, copper, lead, and tin with silver. The company exhibited the hookah, wow, at the Paris International Exhibition of 1867. Wow, who in their right mind would have expected that? Because as we know, objects used to be regularly collected from India, and many of them landed eventually in museums, right? And in a sense, that space is absolutely right, because it offers to put on display a slice of history, an image of foreignness and otherness that is captured, tamed, and showcased in the curated and controlled spaces of, museums, the British museums. But here is how I think that some objects stand apart, going back to my earlier point, because no one will dispute the claim that ethnic, authentic objects are valuable. Oh yes, we absolutely salivate over genuine objects picked up in far-off places. But I think it's radically important at the same time that we study their imitations as well. For example, original things can be quite one-dimensional, really, if you look at it. Their value comes almost solely from their provenance, their place of origin, which is often attractively different and exotic, of course. But the fakes or imitations, in contrast, are not limited precisely because they house infinite stories, stories of conflict, stories of envy, yes, and stories of changing attitudes and new and altering ways of consumption, accounts that are all too often hidden in the glare of the celebrated aura around authenticity. So imitations are a wealth, really, should you want to be a bit more adventurous, and also if you want to explore any object's place in everyday, wider society. So looking at the hookah and the surprise it contained in the fact of its British make and manufacture, I came to think about how these objects might once have had real-life agency, and more widely, the economies of demand and desire that led to the manufacture in the first place. And on these lines, I started looking at the kind of attitude prevalent then. The hookah, for instance, might have enjoyed, the kind of attitudes the hookah might have enjoyed in 19th century Britain when it was made. To be frank, I remembered the hookah from a favorite book, Thackeray's Vanity Fair, which was published in 1848. Here we go, lovely canary yellow cover. In the novel, and you may have seen the film, Joe Sedley is visiting from India. And as an employee of the East India Company, he's a nabob, an over-rich man who often loves Indian things and Indian money, of course. At one point in the novel, he lodges in a hotel, and Thackeray writes in his easy, brilliant wit, let's read it. Major Dobbin, there's another character, Joseph's friend, made his appearance in the next morning very neatly shaved and dressed. Indeed, it was so early in the morning in the lodge that nobody was up in the house. But by then, Joseph's native servant arose and began to get ready his master's ponderous dressing apparatus and prepare his hookah. And then the maidservants got up and meeting the dark man in the passages, shrieked and mistook him for the devil. He and Dobbin stumbled over the pails. What a wonderful description, and it does offer a lot to think about as well. And here is this image. Lovely one. This, in fact, makes a full page in the OUP edition of the novel, so it's an important one. And the hookah bardar, not badar, as it's mistakenly printed on the page, is the man who prepared your hookah and brought it to you. Oh, the luxury. Well, I absolutely love his striking dress and turban, for one thing, but it's also quite interesting to see that the man's expression here. He seems to be absolutely flabbergasted. But it's significant that the maidservants meeting the dark man in the passages shrieked and mistook him for the devil. And the composition, too, is intriguing, for the brush appears so prominently in the illustration, yes, that I cannot help but feel that it almost represents a Victorian hidden wish to clean and lighten the dark skin of the visiting Indian. But the hookah certainly deserves our attention. Its pipe is attractive and curious, there you can see it, and its presence in the English space of the lodge as a form of luxury and enjoyment for the benefit of Joe Sedley, of course, observes how British taste and consumption was slowly and gradually being reformed by India. We do have many references to the curry in the novel, but in fact, so great is Joseph's fondness for smoking the hookah that his sister, the beautiful Amelia, if you remember her, wonders, and I share this quote, "Only Joseph doesn't seem to care much whether I love him or not. He gave me 2 fingers to shake when he arrived after 10 years' absence. He's very good and kind, but he scarcely ever speaks to me. I think he loves his pipe a great deal better than his..." But here Amelia checked herself, for why should she speak ill of a brother? Very characteristic of her, isn't it? Actually, the hookah came to be almost a staple in British Indian life. So the next 2 images I want to look at are from an earlier work of literature, a little-known narrative poem by Charles Doyley called Tom Raw the Griffin. And I'll share the image again. There it is. This is the poem I'm going to talk about, or at least the hookah in it. The poem, a satire really, was a great success in the market when it was published in 1828, and it describes the experience of Tom, a young man who went to India to serve in the East India Company. Tom certainly enjoys his time in the tropics as he meets his countrymen, and the hookah seems to have been commonly used by the British. Here we go. There it is. You can see the picture, and there's that coiled pipe below the table, I think, which you can see. So this is one image. And there's another one in which this gentleman is really enjoying himself. And Tom, I think, has gone to meet this person. For Tom, though, the introduction to the hookah is far from easy. He goes to an important dinner where he sits amongst people of great consequence. The dinner goes smoothly, but oh no, there are other things waiting to happen. So the description is quite interesting, but I'll just show you the image first. Here it is. We can see what's going to happen to Tom. And I will also go on to the text actually now, before coming back to the image again, briefly. So the description ran, "But now the dinner ended, came in the hookahs. Sighed mentally poor Tom, I hope the smoke won't stifle me. The judges, the others that is, poke their long craned necks, speaking by turns and puffing, till in his face and Tom's face the murky columns broke, and in his eyes, nose and mouth there was enough to suffocate the youth. He wriggled quite with coughing." So there it is, the image again. You can see him coughing and there's lots of smoke there. So what a disaster for poor Tom. But clearly the hookah is very much part of Anglo-Indian life. Even though it's for some, it's still alien. The question of alienation, of being foreign, being cast out, or not fully belonging, is quite important, I think. And it can reveal the way in which a society constructs its others, both objects and people. So let's come back to Britain now, and this takes us to Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, published in 1865, in which a caterpillar, yes, most of us remember him, yeah, anyway, most of it, in which a caterpillar famously sat with, yes, it's a him, his hookah, as we can see in a number of illustrations. Yeah, we'll go on to the image. There we go. This was possibly the original one, or there's another one, this one. So Lewis's caterpillar puffs at his hookah throughout, and it makes Alice feel like an intruder, really. But what does it all mean in the mad and curious world of Alice in Wonderland? And what exactly is the hookah doing here? It's obviously a symbol of otherness, and I find that there's a brief but important exchange in this regard. Alice talks about her diminished size with the caterpillar, and she says, here it is, she's talking to the caterpillar, when you have to turn into a chrysalis, you'll feel a little bit queer, won't you? Not a bit, said the caterpillar. Well, perhaps your feelings may be very different, said Alice. All I know is it would feel very queer to me. Excuse me. And then the lines come. You, said the caterpillar contemptuously, who are you? And Alice drew herself up and said very gravely, I think you ought to tell me who you are first. These are very interesting lines. There is clearly an image of clash of cultures, and the failure of language in the scene is key. But even though the caterpillar is only part human, Alice's very prim Englishness begins to feel threatened in its presence. The conversation thus reveals a subtle conflictual claim to space and identity on each side. The caterpillar is often viewed as being a sexualized masculine figure, given its shape and its changing size. Yet, even as masculinity is traditionally about power, the caterpillar's eventual disappearance into a butterfly, as well as the text's repetitive use of the word queer, can alert us today to the way in which being an other could qualify and curtail the traditional powers of maleness. In other words, if you were a foreigner and did not necessarily belong, the conventional power associated with masculinity certainly became reduced and qualified. In this context, the caterpillar's hookah is significant. Let's, for example, look at two images of the hookah in popular culture around that time outside Carroll's text. So here's one. Two men smoking an opium hookah in Shanghai. And this one, the next one, is from London Illustrated News. There it is. And suddenly Carroll's description begins to make sense as we remember that Britain went to two wars with China from 1839 to 1842, and then again from 1856 to 1860. But interestingly, and as we know, while Britain was keen to sell opium in China, opium dens were fast catching on in London, where they became a sign of luxury and danger coming from the East. So the beautifully crafted hookah in this Scottish design gallery, there we go, to come back to our original point, had several cultural references circulating at the time. Indeed, its manufacturer, Hamilton and Company, would have thought long and hard about the kind of hookah they were going to make. So in this item, we can actually see how British aesthetics was revised by the advent of new designs and new ideas from the East. So now, the imitation hookah is fascinating, but what can we say about the Paisley pattern? Here we go. The one that I have here is printed on a cotton cloth made with turkey red dye. But what I'm more interested in is the movement of the pattern and the route it took from India. So many of us would know that 19th century fashion for Indian shawls was nothing less than a phenomenon or style revolution. And here's a picture of the real India shawl from a famous painting, as we know. It all began as men serving in the East India Company started to bring over shawls to Britain. In Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, 1814, that was when it was published, there's a scene in which Mrs. Bertram calls out to her niece that Fanny, William, her nephew, must not forget my shawl if he goes to the East Indies. And I shall give him a commission for anything else that is worth having, says Mrs. Bertram. And I wish he may go to the East Indies that I have my shawl. And Mrs. Bertram's mind is quite made up. She adds, I think I will have 2 shawls, Fanny. The craze for shawls was criticized widely in the context of the East India Company. And I have this lovely image of this one. It's James Gilray's The Leadenhall volunteer dressed in his shawl, 1797, in which an East India Company volunteer is wearing a shawl and definitely not looking very pleased about it. And if you can get past my lovely flowers, you can perhaps see the same image on the wall in the background. So, of course, wealthy women who could afford the shawl's enormous expense when it was not being gifted were absolutely enamored with the accessory. But something quite interesting came out of this elite consumption, as manufacturers in Edinburgh, Norwich, and Paisley soon began to produce their own brand of shawls made in imitation of the Indian. Edinburgh pioneered the industry, but it was Paisley that rapidly came to dominate the market with a somewhat easy outcome. The all British-made cashmere-style shawls came to be euphorically labelled as Paisley Shawls. Paisley, no doubt, worked very hard for its success. Reportedly, if French jacquard looms cost £300 each, homegrown Scottish versions came to be available for a mere 40. So it was clearly common knowledge that the Paisley shawl at the time was a derivative of the Indian. The extent of this reliance is mentioned in Matthew Blair's 1904 study, Paisley Shawl and the Men Who Produced It, where he observes, and I quote, "The most characteristic of designs was the pine pattern. This graceful ornament was present in one form or another in almost every real cashmere shawl, and no imitation of these goods was considered true to art which did not include the design of the pine. The manufacturers occasionally introduced other forms, but these were never popular with the public, and the pine always remained the characteristic feature of the Paisley shawl." So that's Matthew Blair. Yet the extent to which designs were negotiated and copied suggests a surprisingly dynamic field. Patterns were sometimes copied directly from Indian shawls, as well as from French imitations of Indian shawls. We know, for instance, that the shawl manufacturers MacDonald and Gibb of Edinburgh traveled to Paris every year after 1815 to look for shawl designs. Right, in this connection, let me see. Let's get some fairly typical advertisement of shawls. Here we go. This advertisement is from the mid-19th century, if I remember correctly. The shop here claims that it is replete with fine specimens of elegant novelties of the East, as it also highlights the availability of British imitation shawls copied from esteemed Oriental designs. And here's another one, which is headed as Perfection in British Shawls, as you can see. Everington, the shop, availing himself of the advantage to be derived from his extensive stock of India shawls, by copying the most esteemed Asiatic designs, once again, has imported a considerable quantity of cashmere wool and converted it to the manufacture of British shawls. But there can be little doubt, though, that Paisley shawls were really popular, as Charles Knight observed in Household Words. That was a magazine edited by Charles Dickens, and I quote again, there's a beautiful quote, I love it absolutely. "The shawls of Paisley are for the comfort and the decent ornament of the humblest in the land." Heartwarming, absolutely. There were, in fact, several authors who liked talking about shawls in the 1820s. Walter Scott, yes. for instance, wrote about Indian and Paisley wraps in his novel, St. Ronan's Well. There is a Scottish laird in the novel, John Mowbray, and let me share a picture of the cover of the book at that point, St. Ronan's Well. And John Mowbray, the laird, gifts an expensive Indian shawl worth 50 guineas, a lot of money, to his sister Clara. Interestingly, some illustrations in the novel actually picked up on the shawl. There are two illustrations in particular. This is one. Clara Mowbray in her Indian shawl, and there's another towards the end of the novel, which is this one. Anyhow, at one point in the story, Clara turns up for a dinner party without her Indian shawl. She's not wearing it. When her neighbor, a nondescript Mrs. Blower, volunteers her own shawls to Clara. And what does she say? It's very interesting. She says, "There are braw shawls made at Paisley that you would scarce ken from foreign. They're great shawls made in Paisley that it would hardly be different from the foreign ones," she states, proposing that Scottish shawls are just as good as the Indian. Although her offer is made in good intentions, Scott's description clearly registers a bias based on class, and this is how it goes. The excerpt is a tiny bit long, but quite entertaining. Mrs. Blower thrust her broad, good-natured, delighted countenance forwards, and sending her voice from bottom to the top of the table, like her husband when calling to his shipmate, wondered why Miss Mowbray didn't wear that grand Indian shawl. And she presumes, and what does she presume? This is what she presumes, but I'm going to read it in English. No doubt it was for fear of the soup and the butterboats and the like, but she had 3 shawls, which she really found was too many. If Miss Mowbray would like to wear any of them, it was but imitation, to be sure, but it would keep her shoulders as warm as if it were real India. Mrs. Blower's conjecture that Clara did not wear her expensive Indian cashmere because she feared spilling soup on it is emphasized as being too common and utilitarian in social grace. Indeed, her championing of the Paisley in the novel marks a nouveau riche status, which also becomes a source of derisive amusement in the exclusive circle of the spa. She is described by Mr. Winterblossom, one of the members, as fat, fair, and 40. That is all I know of her, a mercantile person. Not very kind, is it? Scott himself is mildly ironic as he describes honest Mrs. Blower for the first time admitted into this worshipful society at St. Ronan's Well, the club. The adverse reading of the Paisley Shawl, however, is overturned a few years later by Scott himself, as Scott tried his hand at an Indian tale, which he called The Surgeon's Daughter. It was published as part of the Chronicles of the Canongate. Excuse me. So the surgeon's daughter narrates, there's another picture. Yeah. So the surgeon's daughter narrates the story of 2 Scottish doctors who go to the subcontinent to make their fortunes. Scott uses several Indian words to give a sense of authenticity in this tale. This is partly set in India. But while the story itself does not necessarily talk about shawls as such, towards the end, the narrator and storyteller, Crystal Croft-Angry is called, reads out his piece to a group of local women. One of them, a formidable lady wearing a real cashmere shawl, enters the description. In Croft-Angry's words, "She threw all other topics out of the field, and from the genuine Indian, she made a digression to the imitation shawls now made at Paisley out of real Tibet wool, not to be known from the actual country shawl, the Indian shawl, except by some inimitable cross-stitch in the border." "It is well," said the old lady, wrapping herself up in a rich cashmere, "that there is some way of knowing a thing that cost 50 guineas from an article that sold for 5, but I venture to say there is not 1 out of 10,000 that would understand the difference." So clearly, Scott seems to prefer the Paisley Shawl here, but Croft-Angry then describes some of the questions that comes from his audience. And one of them is, how could you, Mr. Croft-Angry, collect all these hard words about India? You were never there. And that is absolutely true, actually, because Scott uses so many Indian words in the tale, such as, this is going to be very difficult, quite a few, Angrezi, Sipahi, Sardar, words that are common to me, but perhaps not to most of you there. So to that question that, how could you, Mr. Croft-Angry, collect all these hard words about India? Croft-Angry replies, and I quote, "No, madam, I have not had the advantage. Like the imitative operatives of Paisley, I have composed my tale by incorporating into the woof a little Tibet wool, which my excellent friend and neighbour, Colonel McCarris, one of the best fellows who ever trod a Highland moor or dived into an Indian jungle, had the goodness to supply me with," the words. In real life, Colonel McCarris was Scott's friend, James Ferguson, who supplied the author several Indian words. But if you observe carefully, Scott isn't just talking about shawls here, is he? Although the analogy is, in a sense, local, it is also significant that the Paisley shawl emerges as a larger metaphor to symbolize Scotland's association with the wider world. In this regard, we might reflect that when Croft-Angry begins to imagine his tale, Scott's first readers would have been aware that he was entering into a specific tradition of writing about the Orient. There it is, because fiction about the Arabian Nights and the fables of Pilpay, or the fables of Bidpai, as they called them, were popular reading in Britain. There we have the Arabian Nights. But literary writing focused ever more intensely on the East during this period, the Romantic period, that's between 1780 and 1830. Henry Weber, Scott's secretary for a period around 1813, if I remember rightly, also published Tales from the East and cashing on such a demand. Beautiful one here, Tales from the East. Indeed, translations of Persian poets such as Ferdowsi, Hafiz, and Saadi were popular, and they also influenced the poetry of Lord Byron, Thomas More, and others. Scott's private writing shows that he was actually quite anxious to include Indian words in the Surgeon's Daughter. A journal entry in 1827 reads, "I wrote 4 or 5 leaves, but begin to get aground for want of Indian localities. Colonel Ferguson's absence is unlucky, so is Max Boffle, and half a dozen Koihas beside, willing to write chits, eat tiffing, and vent all their pagan jargon when one does not want to hear it. And now that I want a touch of their slang, lo, there is no one near me." To his publisher, Robert Cadell, too, Scott wrote how he absolutely wanted Indian phrases. And information. I'm pausing on the last sheets of volume 2, he says, because I await Colonel Ferguson's return to get us some Indian phrases and information. James Ferguson's manuscript, Sketches of India, is now preserved in the LNS, the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh. While Scott eagerly searched for Indian words to spice up his exotic tale, there can be little doubt that the author's enthusiasm for ethnic words was at the center of the nation's needs. So how was it at the center of the nation's needs? Yes, during the early decades of the 19th century, the issue of Indian languages was not trivial. A knowledge of these was an important criterion for lucrative appointments in India. And learning Persian and Arabic, official languages of India at the time, was emphasized at the training colleges of the East India Company. The culture of learning Indian languages also exerted a significant pressure on writers and authors. James Mill's monumental The History of British India was published in 1817. And here we go. For example, this book was severely criticized on the basis that the author had no knowledge of Indian languages. In another instance, the Scottish historian William Robertson echoed similar concerns in his historical account of India, published in 1791, and he wrote, "I was so fully aware of the disadvantages under which I labored in undertaking to describe countries of which I had not any local knowledge, that I have been at the utmost pains to guard against any errors which this might occasion." The insecurities of Croftingry and Scott about using Indian words then were located within a larger concern about epistemological or knowledge-based validity. It is interesting that Scott used his friend Ferguson's words in the belief that linguistic knowledge would create a sense of authenticity, but seen widely, Scott's careful gleaning and use of Indian words and his analogy of Paisley shawl making proposed an economy of industrial progress in which the East was relegated to a supplier of raw materials, either in terms of the genuine Tibet wool that went into the making of Paisley shawls, or as a supplier of Eastern literary themes. In conclusion, for that's where we are, in conclusion, the recent emphasis on decolonization has forced us to look more closely at colonial objects that were brought over to Britain from its far-flung colonies. But while authentic objects have long ruled the roost in scholarship and in display, perhaps it is time to look at how decolonization also involves a new consideration of fakes and imitations that not only shaped British life and consumption, but also, no doubt, formed an unlikely aesthetic bridge between the colonizers and the colonized. So, rather than the idea of appropriation, which so often marks up popular and scholarly discourse, I'd like to reflect on how imitation works as the sincerest form of admiration and flattery in 19th century British material culture. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, yes, that's all. So,
hello, can you hear me, Suchitra?
Yeah, very well. Thank you, James.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that really fascinating talk. Now we're moving on to the question and answer part of today's lunchtime talk, and I'll just start by looking at the Q&A here. We have a question by Puyumi, and that is, I really like how you begin the talk with your experience of a visit to the V&A and that spiraling onto your understanding of what is lacking in the labelling and history that is covered in museums. Could you maybe speak a bit more about what led you to your broader research work on shawls in relation to your understanding of UK history, or just what has inspired this area of research?
Yes, thank you so much for this question. Quite a wide and broad question, but a very interesting one. So first of all, I did my PhD at the University of Glasgow, and where I researched how shawls were represented in British literature. Actually, it goes back further. I started with the research of how Indian objects appear in literature, and then I went on to, spotting shawls as being quite a common one, quite a familiar one for a lot of people. So that's the background. And then, of course, I realized that I need to sort of perhaps study what kind of history has been written about shawls in general and the Paisley shawl in particular. And I noticed that they seem to be very, very material readings, and they're absolutely fantastic in their rigor. And they describe the designs and the weave and how the design, for example, moved away or moved back and things like that, and how the French were involved in it too, albeit from a distance. I read all that, and I was really impressed by the scholarship. And we remember John Irwin is one of the first scholars who wrote this famous book on shawls, and there were other scholars as well who wrote about the regional shawls. Those, Valerie Riley and the other person from Norwich, Pamela. So these were really interesting to read, but I realized that perhaps at this time we need to move away from a thoroughly material reading to a slightly more cultural reading. Now, why so? It's very interesting culturally because for me as an Indian, it's fascinating how an Indian object, it appears so, it seems to be so established, so embedded in British literature, from, let's say, 1790s to about definitely 1870s and even further, and even in the 20th century, actually. So that was very fascinating for me. But then there's this background which keeps talking to you, like, why are the British getting it here? And that's when we start asking questions that what kind of contribution did the British Empire make to this kind of appearance of objects? This kind of regularly appear, this kind of objects that regularly appear in British texts and British culture. And this is where I think the V&A label work comes in, because I was invited by the V&A, along with others, with Emma Bond and others, to sort of try and decolonize the labels as existed. And the labels were quite good, but they were perhaps a little bit narrow just because some time had passed. And with this recent emphasis on decolonization, I thought, and they thought rather, and I just gave comments, and I think it was Meredith Moore who did most of the work alongside other people. And it was very interesting to see how we could sort of propose a shift from a very, very sort of British-focused description to a slightly, rest of the world focused kind of thing. And it worked very well. And because I'm very interested in British imperialism, its history, in Britain especially, I was able to put in, little bits here and there, and it worked out quite well. So I'm really happy with this massive opportunity that the V&A offered, personally to me, but also to all of us, really, which makes us so much more sensitive to what was going on in the background. So yes, so that's my answer, I guess.
No, that answer was wonderful, Suchitra. Thank you so much for putting that so eloquently. I've got another question here, in fact, from Violetta, which is, thank you very much for a beautiful talk. Could you say a few words about the situation with studying such language as Sanskrit, Hindi, and others in the UK at the beginning of the 19th century? Violet's asking because here in Russia, there was a specialist in Sanskrit at the turn of the 18th and the 19th centuries, Mr. Lebedev, and he was involved in literary circles of the time. So could you maybe talk a bit more about that?
This is fascinating, and it makes a really, is it Violet? I don't know. It's talking about Russia, right? And it's really fascinating to know how Indian languages, they were studied all over. Now, when we talk about British Orientalism, which for me is a very positive word, but which for others, it almost is a term of abuse. I find it very interesting that so many British people, and they were interested in learning our language and our culture. And I think it's fascinating, flattering, not just flattering, it's fascinating, and it's very happy. It's quite a happy thing. But then if you start looking more deeply into it, these people, the Orientalists of the late 19th century, such as William Jones, they were employed by the East India Company. And so basically they were doing the job for the East India Company. And of course, the job of the East India Company was to colonize the country, and the country had begun to be colonized anyways by 1757. So the Company of Britain, I don't know, it's connected, right? It's sort of a gray area to talk about, the East India Company and Britain. But Britain wanted to control India, and they wanted to know, let's put it this way, what makes these people tick? And for that, they had to go to the ancient language and ancient text. So I think that was a basis. So for me, it's really half and half. And I love the time, absolutely. Just like in Tom Raw or in Walter Scott, there's so many Indian words. And definitely I'm not thinking, oh no, he's using them for, colonizing. I see it in a broader base. I just see it from broader background, like, oh, that's my language. I can recognize it. And oh, we've made an impact here. I just see it like that. And I think it's fascinating to read it in those terms. But of course, we all have our own sort of research backgrounds, and we all have our active backgrounds. What kind of action are you going to take, or are you an activist or not? And activism also can go in several directions, and there can be lots of discussions within it. So yeah, that's pretty much my take on it. And thank you so much for the question, Violetta.
Thank you so much. Next question is actually from myself. And I was just going to comment and say how I just loved how your presentation was peppered with so many references to literature. And I was just more or less wondering, where's been the most, or what has been the most surprising reference in literature you've found to patterned India shawls? Is there any that have completely just sort of sidelined you in a way when you came across it?
That's such a wonderful question, James. Thank you. Well, yeah, they have been. I've had my moments, and they are just lovely. I think I'll begin with the first one, because the Paisley Shawl is quite famous here, and it's a huge heritage object, and everybody's saying, wow, gorgeous, fantastic. But then if you read the literature, they're like, it's a very snobbish view. The writers think, they say, oh, that's not good enough. No, the Indian one's better. If you didn't have money, you probably wore that. So that kind of thing really made me think of the Paisley Shawl in terms of its British and Scottish heritage. I thought, wait a minute, you don't have the whole story, because they're beautiful shawls, absolutely wonderful shawls. They're gorgeous. I actually have one, and my cats are very interested in it. But I love that shawl, and all the shawls, they're just stunning, absolutely. But at the same time, to get its history right, we have to understand them in terms of an imitation. I think that's quite important, because when you talk about shawls or other objects as imitation, we can also go to beware theory, because we can think of them as, this is a post-colonial theory about imitation, which is about empowering the colonized. And if one is interested in that kind of discourse and research and reading, one can connect a lot of things together. So I find it fascinating. That was one moment when I thought it needs to be highlighted as an imitation, the Paisley Shawl. The second one's about the Indian shawl, and this is the image I showed, and which is there in the background. And I'm not going to move my head just because there's a tiny bit of vertigo that I'm experiencing. So in that image, if you remember, this East India Company person, the volunteer, he's wearing an Indian shawl, and he's not very pleased. First of all, shawls were male garments that came over from India, so that's probably mimicking that habit. But at the same time, this is actually a comment on how foreign things are really corroding our British identity. So I found it fascinating. And this is 1797 and really early on. And this is just the beginning of the empire. And we will, of course, get our independence in 1947. Yes.
Thank you. We have another question lined up, in fact, from Van at this time. During the time, did the Paisley shawl feature in what would have been considered Indian popular culture at the time of the late 18th and early 19th century? And, did that sort of work the other way around? Since people in the so-called West were, mentioning patterned shawls within the literature, was it also taking place in the Indian subcontinent?
That's a question I'm often asked, but I have not really seen much reference to the shawl. I think there's one reference to Tagore. My husband tells me, who reads a lot of Bengali literature, that they're talking about English shawls. And I think by that, they would have meant the Paisley shawl, the Norwich shawl, and they were seen as like English. They were seen, they were called English, although they meant British, Britain as a whole, of course, as you would know, James. So I unfortunately haven't seen much difference, but that is very exciting because we can open new research into it, because the Paisley shawl is such a huge thing, not just in Britain, but all over the world, really. Less so in India, but definitely all over the world, the rest of the world. But it should be fascinating to find out more. Yes.
Yeah, completely. It's almost like an untapped way of research that's still to be looked into.
Absolutely.
Which actually then brings me on. If you're comfortable to speak about it, understand you're just coming to the end of your manuscript for your research work, and I'd wonder if you'd wanted to even speak a little bit about that.
Oh, that's well. Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, so I'm writing a book on Kashmir or Indian and Paisley. I think it's called Kashmir though. Kashmir and Paisley Shawls in British literature. And I'm contracted with the Ohio University Press, and it's a happy thing that I've submitted their revised manuscript, and I'm waiting to hear from them. And it's been a labor of love, really, going on for about a decade. Oh, yeah, but I'm really happy that I've done it, because I really believe in the project, and I think people are generally interested to know, descriptions of shawls and in literature. So that's what it is. And there's another point there, of course. I mean, I call it the Kashmir shawl, but that in part refers to the wool. But in general, I'm referring to 19th century usage, just in the way I'm calling it Paisley shawl and not Norwich or Edinburgh. So in that too, I'm repeating 19th century usage, because it's a historical work of research, and I talked about textile history, how textile history left its impact on literary history, and how lots of people like to write about Indian things. And these writers include, Charles Dickens, Wilkie Collins, Elizabeth Inchbold, Walter Scott, and so many others. It's absolutely fascinating. And I've also got these advertisements and things like that. So it's been quite a fruitful experience as of now. And I'm really looking forward to the next project, the next stage of the project. Yeah. Thanks, James.
That's great, honestly, because I can speak for us here that we're also very excited to see the next stage in the manuscript as well when it comes out. So I think that's all the questions that we have today. So I think that actually brings us to a close this afternoon. But before we scoot off, I'd like to thank you again, Suchitra, from all of us here at BNA Dundee and beyond, for the tremendous presentation this lunchtime. And we hope you all enjoyed this afternoon's talk, and do keep on the lookout, because we have lots of other enthralling events to look forward to. This is including the next instalment of Design in the Diaspora, Instagram live series focusing on the creative output from diasporic communities across Scotland. This is taking place this Sunday at 12 over on our Instagram at BNA Dundee. We've also got our next upcoming lunchtime talk in September time, exploring objects again from our Scottish design galleries with Dr. Emma Bond of the Transnational Scotland Project. We've posted a few details about that in the chat, but please do check out our website for all upcoming events. So all I have left to say is, again, thank you so much, Suchitra. Thank you kindly to everyone for attending today and for joining us, and just getting involved today. And many thanks to Max as well for the live BSL interpretation today. Couldn't have done it without you. And thank you to our members, donors, partners, and folk behind the scenes making all this happen. So have a smashing afternoon, and we hope to see you again soon. So see you later.
See you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.